web API endpoint, which is basically a string with all data, right? What I'm doing is automatically mock any intercept any AJAX code that I made, and then I'm going to parse your data query as well. Then using HSJS is going to call a .NET version of this testing framework, because the thing is that I'm so lazy that I want to implement the query engine again in JavaScript. So what I'm doing is calling. Every time you call want to query something from JavaScript, in the end it's calling the FakeXRMEasy version in C# using this HSJS proxy. And that's basically executing queries using query expressions, which is a mess as well. And that's returning the results to the client side. So then the purpose is that once you get familiar with testing on server side, then testing on client side. Testing on client side is way more simple. Like for example, it's basically the same approach. For example, test query.
We're supposed to see the code on screen now.
Huh?
We're supposed to see the code on screen now.
Sorry?
We're supposed to see the code on the screen now.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. Okay. Close button, check one. So there you go. This is what I wanted to show initially. But basically, it's using the same approach. So whenever, for example, this is testing that the select should be true fields specified in the select clause. So I'm testing again the testing framework. So say for example I have a list of accounts, right? Where I have company 1, company 2. So I'm doing a web API call, and once this is finished, this is automatically doing all the mocks, intercepting AJAX calls, and when that finishes, I'm making sure that, for example, it should return 2 records, that the first one should be company 1, should be company 2, and then I shouldn't have the other attribute that I have in here because I'm selecting only name and revenue attributes, nothing else, for example. So it's the same approach. Once you basically get familiar with the server side, then client side will be pretty much the same thing. So I think that was pretty much. So let me go back to the slide. Based on doing properly, it might be fine doing a unit test phase, but then as you basically go into the integration, okay, because it was just returning a dummy list of entities that was failing.
And in CRM, you realistically do integration testing because you don't know what else is going to break when you introduce it.
Yeah, I think that's one of the difficulties though, is people forget 2 things in my experience. The first one is, especially with Dynamics and any integration project, there are 2 aspects of the problem. The first one is obviously integration points, how they do it, and you can return dummy data and that proves the concept. But the second thing is data copies, and obviously CRM is mainly about managing all that massive amount of data, and that's how that does great stuff. So it's often better to work through acceptance test-like scenarios all the way into the unit test. But what that does is take what you expect to see at the outer layer and pipe it straight through that unit test point, because that then forces the data to be exactly as you expect it to be. Because putting dummy data in, as you say, will pass the unit test, but it can be bored when it comes to integration points and acceptance. So I think that certainly is the way I tend to tackle integration projects.
And that's the real challenge, really, hitting those scenarios where you don't expect it. For example, if you're customizing, say, the lead qualification stage, that's quite, built into CRM specifically the way it works. If you try and customize that, you're going to run into challenges. And that's where something like testing really benefits.
Absolutely. And you're absolutely right. That's always a difficult point. Microsoft have done their work. And they're trying to make Dynamics work, haven't they? That's all in the vision. And so you don't need to test that. You can make the assumption that that's actually working. So all the integration points of the business are working. Well, I totally agree.
But yeah, basically there are 2 steps. First step is unit testing, and then you should have integration testing as well. But the thing is that this is saving is kind of the development phase as well. For me, it helped me a lot for basically mitigating the regression issues while doing MVC, for example. Because something was completely random in the past, which was manual testing. It was a web application was growing, so it was even harder to test every single time. So at least when we run a few regression and production was great. And then you have integration as well. Yeah.
Yeah,
but I think we should start with something.
Well, no, I agree. You have to have both. It's one of those necessary but not sufficient things, isn't it? You have to have both of those.
Yeah.
So because you have to start with something, but I mean, a lot of the time the specification often defines what that test is should actually look like.
Yeah.
I agree.
That's a good point.
So
There's a kind of an element of training BA as well about
precisely.
writing proper specification with scenarios, that kind of stuff as well.
Yeah. And I think in a way the fact that for me Symposium we started using that looks like Jasmine, because that does give you that baseline way of turning that natural language if you like into something a bit more book friendly.
Exactly.
Yeah, definitely about that.
Good question I have. The demo you showed was using early bound types. I'm assuming it's equally compatible using late bound, is it?
Yes, we can navigate to distributed users as well. But there's one big advantage using early bound types, which is you will be able to spot, for example, if someone changes the schema on CRM, for example, something as basic as deleting an attribute, the big difference is that you will see that breaking during the build phase before the unit testing phase, right? So if you have a massive TFS project, that's a big difference because you don't have to wait until you run all the unit tests. You can spot that before.
Yeah, I can tell you that you look on site. Because you can't, there's risks doing certain things early down
One good thing as well about FakeXRMEasy that Ian said was that it was also checking that the attributes existed on the other one types as well. So if basically you refresh the type identities, even though the FakeXRMEasy is dynamic, it's going to fail the unit test as well.
Vectors your own kind of estimates. I mean, obviously it is hit and miss with a lot of projects. A lot of the time you get lucky, don't you? I mean, well, what are your opinions on that? Like,
I think it really speeds up development. You were saying just debug your unit tests, you have to deploy it, so it saves you that cycle of deploying it, checking it, it's not worked, deploy it, check it. Sure, that cycle is really good.
But I think there's always going to be a trade-off, right? Because sometimes it's not really worth going down that route if you've got very much a standard system and not much customization. It's probably not worth investing that time and effort in doing that testing because the product has come out with some sort of degree of testing done on it already. So you rely on
Some degree. But I think that's the key point. The word there is trade-off, and I think that's the crucial aspect of it.
This is again in relation to what they said in PowerShell. It's basically you have to think as well, even though it's a small project, it's basically the foundation of something that should work. So even though it's a small project, maybe it's an initial cost, but the thing we're doing in where I'm working right now is kind of measuring the full arbitrary of time spent across from the PVI all across tasks and bug fixes, but not bug fixes in functional testing, bug fixes time spent in regression testing and production. So then we can measure, okay, you don't want to use unit testing because in theory you're saving time, but in the long term it's going to cause a lot of issues. So
the actual value of that approach is you don't register the plugin and switch off while you're running the button. You're going to save a large amount of time, literally, because you can actually debug it without actually having to CRM running. And blocking everyone else at some point.
That's the crucial, I think. The fact is that developer users without any CRM installed nothing. So if you think about that from a license perspective, that in itself is a good thing. There's a trade-off there, isn't it? So that's a great benefit. But also the other thing is, just to mention what we said about, especially Dynamics, you have like 10 or 12 different things that talk to each other, if that makes sense. So if you think about running an integration on acceptance test across that, and say that fails, and you've hit 10 things, it's either in something or the bug is either in something or not. That makes sense. So if you think about the combination of those things, that's 2 to the power 10 possible searches you have to do. That's 1,024 different combinations that could be here. But with unit tests, you isolate it down to just one, because you control the rest of the environment around it, which I think is derives a better benefit in terms of thinking around the problem with it. So again, there are positive and negative trade-offs across the board based on understanding what level of benefit you're using each time.